The Jews didn't understand this because there was a rational and very successful policy of misleading the Jewish councils. I'll give you one simple example that will have to stand for many. Chernyakov, the head of the Jewish council, comes in Warsaw, comes in one day, and he finds that the office is a buzz. What's the buzz? There are always rumors, of course, in the ghetto. The buzz is that the Nazis are about to liquidate the ghetto. Kill the children, liquidate the ghetto. He puts on his coat, he goes off to see his Nazi connections. He gets to the headquarters, meets a low-level officer, tells him about the rumor. The officer says to Chernyakov, it's all a lie, it's all a rumor, go home. Tell the people it's not true. He doesn't feel right, the man is not senior enough, he's not sure. He waits a few hours, works himself up to the next officer, the next officer. Finally, the most senior officer in the building, the officer says to Chernyakov, believe me, if something was going to happen, I would know. After all, the fact is this couldn't happen without me. But you can go home and be reassured on my confidence that this is not going to happen. He goes home, he tells the Jewish police to go out into the streets. They go out, people get a good night's rest. What he didn't know, he subsequently found out 2 days later, was that the group of SS that were there already to begin the transport of Jewish children out of the ghetto and begin the great deportations, which would eventually lead to the closing of the ghetto and the murder of all its population, was already in Warsaw. And this was a purposeful plan to mislead him and the Jews all along. Elsewhere, the same thing happened. For example, in Vilna, they came to Jacob Gens, the head of the ghetto community, and they told him that they were going to send 5,000 Jews to Kovna. Not to worry, they needed workers in Kovna. Gens went and rounded up 5,000 Jews, promising them that their life would be safe. They would only be sent to Kovna. But the fact is, they were sent not to Kovna, but they were taken out to Panari, the open pits nearby, and all of them were shot. And so it went in ghetto after ghetto, day after day. The Jews never really understood their situation until it was very late in the game. Also, I remind you that in the ghettos, Jews had no weapons. They had no access to arms. And that's true in all the ghettos. I won't go through the Bialystok, the Vilna, the Kovna ghetto, where there is a small efforts at physical resistance, except to say that there is no real military supply. Now, because of all these things, you have to understand that physical resistance could only finally be undertaken in the ghettos when they knew that death was certain. Otherwise, it was a rational calculation to throw your life away. And therefore, in most ghettos, it came too late, or it came late in the day. It did come, as we'll see, but it came late when the population was already to a significant degree depleted. Secondly, I don't have time, I just mentioned to you that in the Einsatzgruppen murders, where 1.5 million Jews or more were killed in 2 sweeps by the 4 Einsatzgruppen between the summer of 1941 and the end of 42, there was no opportunity really for resistance of any kind. The Wehrmacht, the SS arrived, they rounded Jews up, they took them out to the edge of the city, took them to the synagogue, took them to the old people's home, set the buildings alight, shot them in mass graves. So the idea of thinking of resistance in that context, which people always forget, about 25% of all losses took place with Einsatzgruppen. That the very notion of resistance, it was impossible, there was no organized resistance. Overnight, the Russian army collapsed. And right with the Russian army's collapse came the Wehrmacht. And next to the Wehrmacht came the Einsatzgruppen. And immediately the Einsatzgruppen went to work murdering people. There was no time to organize anything that looks like resistance. Now, against all of this, which is not a happy story. But if you assimilate, if you think about what I've told you, you begin to understand how difficult, how impossibly difficult the situation was. I want to talk about acts of resistance per se. Now, there are two kinds of resistance that one has to keep in mind when one talks about the Shoah. In most cases, like the French underground, the most famous underground, Italian underground, the Dutch underground, the famous Norwegian underground, what were they doing? They were fighting to free their country politically from oppression. That was the target of their activity. What was the act of resistance on the part of a Jew in the ghetto? What did it mean? What was an act of resistance? They were not trying to reestablish a state. They were not trying to just overthrow a foreign overlord and gain their political status. No, there were two things at stake. One, and very importantly, was to show that they were human beings. That the Nazi assault on the Jew was not a political assault of the normal kind. The Nazi assault on the Jew was an assault on their humanity, on their dignity, on their belonging to the human family. The Nazi assault was a denial that they belonged to the family of moral obligation, that anyone had any reason to protect them, to abide by ethical standards with regard to them. So the first thing that everywhere is a common feature of Jewish life is the need to resist dehumanization and to show that one still belonged to the human family, that one still carried the image of a moral being. And this leads to an entire subject, almost without any precedent in most discussion of resistance in other settings, of what's called spiritual resistance. Spiritual resistance, I would say, are acts that defend Jewish dignity, that defend Jewish humanity, that insist on the valence of Jewish ethical and moral status. And you see this everywhere. Wherever the ghettos existed long enough, you will find spiritual resistance. Spiritual resistance means a whole bunch of different things. For example, it means teaching students, giving them a hope of a future. See this in the Vilna Ghetto, in the Lodz Ghetto, in the Warsaw Ghetto. You see performance of musical, theatrical, poetic kinds. You see religious services on Yom Kippur and elsewhere. In the Warsaw Ghetto, there were, according to reports, thousands of daily prayer quorums, minyanim. I remember on the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, being at Auschwitz as a part of the American delegation. And I met there the chief rabbi of Warsaw, at that time an old man. He walked me around the camp, and he told me his story. He told me how every morning he would run from his barracks before sunrise, and he would take his bread ration and he would trade part of it in the next barrack where there was a pair of tefillin. People who aren't human, creatures who aren't human, bacilli, don't put on tefillin in the morning. Don't worry about praising the Almighty for making us a Jew. In all the camps we have Passover Seders, where people saved the little they had to try to get together to have some kind of commemoration of liberation. There were underground radios, which of course were forbidden. There were newspapers. If you go to Yad Vashem, you will find thousands of pages of ghetto newspapers. Now that's important because what it was saying is, we're not going to let the Nazis dominate this historical story. We're going to record our story. And of course, this is especially true of the group in the Warsaw Ghetto that collected all the information they could and eventually buried it in what was called the Oneg Shabbat archives, which was then subsequently dug up after the war. The Jews were going to put their voice so that was not be a monolith of oppression. There were soup kitchens in all the ghettos where they tried very hard to take what little they had, especially to look after children, orphanages, hospitals, secret libraries in Vilna and elsewhere. So that in all of these places, you have acts of the affirmation of human dignity. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is a crucial thing, given the assault against the Jews. It's not just that they would be murdered, but that they would be murdered as filth. They would be murdered as a legitimate act of cleansing, that they were feces to be swept away by the larger community. Also, you have individual acts of great heroism of different sorts, by teachers, by doctors. And also, I should tell you, I think is really an act of resistance. An interesting fact, among the Jews of Eastern Europe, despite the conditions, there were very few suicides. You would have expected many more. The only place we see a lot of suicides in Jewish life is actually in Vienna, in Austria, after the Auschitwz. And that's because the Austrian Jews were so acculturated, they just couldn't handle the radical turmoil that existed overnight. So that if there were just all of these negative conditions, and there were these positive spiritual acts, one might say, as you say at the Passover Seder, Dayenu, that would be quite a bit. Enough. But despite this, I want to say to you that there was a great deal of physical resistance. And it came in the ghettos, it came in partisan groups, and it came even in the death camps, which is more and more remarkable to me as I learn more and more about the camps. First of all, there were physical acts, which we could enumerate, of individual Jewish policemen who attacked a German soldier, a Jewish woman who would attack a Nazi in the streets, people who tried to slip out of ghettos by killing various Nazi surrogates. But they were, of course, not numerically consequential. More importantly are Jews in undergrounds, physical resistance in undergrounds. First of all, we don't think of it, but you should know that in all the major countries there were Jews in large number in local undergrounds. In Poland, for example, half of the Polish state, there were 30 million non-Jewish Poles, 3 million Jewish Poles. The Jewish partisan numbers were equal to the non-Jewish partisan numbers, about 50-50. Now, of course, one can't blame the Poles. The fate of the Poles was a different fate, despite all the talk of relativizing the two. But the fact is that Jews were very prominent in the Polish underground. They represented about 20% of the French underground, which is never mentioned, much of the leadership of the French underground. They were very important in the Italian underground. In fact, as a sign of honor, many of the Italian groups took the name of their Jewish leaders, and eventually, if they were caught, were given the name posthumously. In addition, there was armed resistance in the ghettos by Jewish groups. Now, you all know about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and I could tell you more about that, but I won't. I'll just say that there were about 1,100, almost 1,100 ghettos. People often have a very narrow view of ghetto life. They know about Warsaw, they know about Vilna, Białystok, Kovna. The big ghettos are known. But I should tell you that a close study, which is incomplete, but which I've engaged in for many, many years, and I could read you the names of some of the ghettos, tells me that about 64 ghettos so far were places where there was physical resistance. That means armed physical resistance by the Jewish underground. Not just Warsaw, but 64. Now, that may be a small relative number, but in light of the conditions and the circumstances that I've mentioned to you, I think it's quite remarkable that there were 64 ghettos at least, in which there was physical uprising. In Sarny, in mid-42. In Latva, the underground set the camp on fire and 1,000 Jews ran to the woods. In the Mir Ghetto in 42, the Jews left the ghetto, acted in an armed uprising. Here, of course, those of you who know something about the Holocaust should know that this was the place where Daniel Rufeisen was actioned. Daniel Rufeisen later became Brother Daniel. I don't know if any of you know the case of Brother Daniel. If you don't, I'll let Lynn tell you some other time. In Bialystok, in August 1943, 5 days of fighting on the part of the Jewish underground. In the Slonim Ghetto, the Jews rose up, managed to free several hundred Jews who ran to the local forests. In Lvov, there was physical action in June of 43, though the whole ghetto was eventually murdered, liquidated by the SS. In the Dyatlova Ghetto, uprisings. In the Katz Ghetto, 1,200 Jews ran to the forest. In the Goldische Ghetto, 1,200 Jews joined partisans. In Kovna, the Jews acted with great heroism. 160 Jews finally maintained their ability to go out into the forest. Also there, I should tell you a very famous story that really should be known. The Jewish police have a very bad reputation. Much of it is deserved, especially the second group of Jewish police. The first group of Jewish police, most of whom were drawn from local people in the ghettos, were murdered. And then the second wave of Jewish police were brought in from outside the local ghetto, so they didn't have the same attachment. But in Kovna, a very famous event took place. As the underground was planning its uprising, the Nazis, of course, everywhere had spies. And so they told the Jewish leadership that they had to go out and find out who the leadership of the underground was, bring back the names, and they would round them up and murder them. The Jewish council went to the Jewish police and told them what had been asked of them. None of the Jewish police were willing to do it. In the end, 140 Jewish police were rounded up by the Nazi army, by the Nazi officials. All of them were murdered, but the underground was not betrayed. Quite a remarkable story. In Voronovich in 42, there was a major uprising, and so it goes. Czestochowa, all over, physical resistance. Minsk, Tarnow. Secondly, besides partisans and besides ghetto resistance, I just want to say a word about the death camps. Physical resistance in the death camps. What an amazing idea. The closer I get, at least to the literature, after 40 years of study, I must tell you the less I really comprehend about the death camp. I don't know how anyone managed the day at Auschwitz, Birkenau. How anyone managed the day at Treblinka, Majdanek. The gratuitous violence, the complete commitment to the denial that any sort of respect for the smallest kind of ethical behavior existed between an Aryan and a Jew. The obvious fact that they were factories of death meant to swallow up the Jewish people. The excremental assault, which was a daily part of life. The burning smell of a huge barbecue that belched out from the crematoria, the sun never shone. The absence of food, the presence of disease, the sportmachen of the guards. The notion that Jews were, as the Germans called them, pieces, not human beings. As Primo Levi tells us, one of the guards said to him once, "Here there is no why, Nothing made any ordinary sense. Franz Stengel, when later interviewed by Reconsidering, was asked, "What were you doing? What are you thinking?" He said, "It was garbage. It was a huge problem of garbage disposal." Garbage disposal. Now, it's in that situation that you have people who suffered for years in the ghettos, then their final journey sent to the camps. These terrible train journeys. They get off the train and they get their haircuts. If they go into the gas, they get their haircuts whether they go in or not. 90% plus of Jews who come to the camps, and more in places like Treblinka, which had no work detail. Velno, that really had no work detail. Sobibor, that had no work detail. Went immediately into the furnace. For the small number of Jews who survived, who were singled out for physical labor in the camp setting, most especially at Auschwitz, because the Nazis created a work camp nearby. IG Farben, Siemens, all of the big companies were able to hire cheap labor and essentially work people to death without regard. Jews rose up in these conditions nevertheless. You should know that in at least 3 of these ghettos, and at least 3 of these death camps, there were acts of physical resistance, major acts of physical resistance. Of course, in each they were aided, led by the Zonda Commandos. The Zonda Commandos were the young Jewish men who were perhaps the most unfortunate of all Jewish victims during the war. They were the people kept alive for 90 days as a rule, to work the death process, to push people into the ovens, to the chambers, and then to open the chambers and go in with long hooks to disengage the various bodies that were hugging each other, that had turned pink and green, that had defecated on themselves. They were the people who went and opened the mouth of the dead to see that they could take out the gold teeth. They were the ones who checked the private parts of females on the myth that all Jewish people were wealthy and were hiding their wealth. It was they who ran the crematoria. But because they had some movement in the camps and freedom of movement, and they knew the story, they knew that their fate was already signed, they, in each of these instances, rose up, organized resistance. In Treblinka, we don't talk enough about Treblinka. You have to know that in 18 months of its existence, 875,000 approximately Jews were killed at Treblinka. Almost no survivors of Treblinka. A handful. They organized an armed activity, and they rose up against the SS. And in the fall of 1943, beginning late August 1943, 4:30 in the morning, they broke out of the camp, they killed the guards, they ran to the forest. Almost all of them were tracked down and murdered, but it had a very important effect. After the uprising at Treblinka, Himmler ordered the closing of the camp. There was no more death at Treblinka. At Sobibor, which is a camp that is little known, the fact is that 250,000 Jews were killed. Again, almost no work. In the end, only a few individuals survived the camp, no children. In all these camps, the children immediately, of course, almost without exception, went to their death. They started to plan an uprising. In late 43, the underground began to plan seriously an uprising against the Gestapo. And on October 13th, 1943, the Zonda Commandos led this uprising. They killed 11 Ukrainian guards with axes, that's all they had. They went to the gates and opened the gates, and 610 prisoners escaped. Unfortunately, 300 were soon shot. Afterwards, another 150 were shot, and altogether only a small number survived. But ultimately, again, it had a consequence. Sobibor was closed. At Auschwitz in October of 1944, the Zonda Commandos blew up the crematoria. Most of the uprising was quelched, but as a result of the uprising in Auschwitz in October 1944, something very important happened. Himmler ordered that there should be no more gassings in Auschwitz, which had material consequences, which we see from the liberation of Auschwitz on January 18, 1945. In the last interregnum, in that period between October and January, there were still 60 to 70,000 Jews alive in Ghetto, in the camp, who were then mostly forced marched on the infamous death marches. Some of them survived, many died, but the fact is that none of them would have been alive had the crematoria continued their operation into October, November, December. So this was a very direct kind of activity. Now, it's an amazing story to think about all of that. There's one other thing I want to share with you, and I hope that you won't misunderstand. All of the activity, especially in the death camps, is really monumental. And people ask, why wasn't there more? It's a fair question. Why wasn't there more? There always could have been more. People could have done better. But I want to point out a comparative bit of information that maybe puts the whole story in a different light. There were 5 million Russian prisoners of war. 5 million. They were all soldiers. They didn't have to worry about families. Their families were somewhere else. They were trained in military affairs. They had a command structure. And within the first 6 months of the war, it was clear to the captured prisoners of war that their fate was sealed. They were being starved to death. Millions were dying. And yet no major act of resistance was undertaken by 5 million Russian prisoners of war. Now, I don't tell you this to impugn the behavior of the Russian prisoners of war. They were starving, they were cold, they were beaten, they were psychologically defeated. I tell you this only to make the point that this is what one should expect. That under the conditions under which these people lived, survived a day, a second day, a third day, to ask for what we normally think of as in the movies, resistance is an unthinkable thing. They did what was perfectly normal. They essentially became apathetic and capitulated to their circumstance. In the case of the Jews, where the number of victims is almost the same, higher, of course, with children involved, and you can't ask 1.5 million children to resist. What kind of resistance could 1.5 million children supply? You have all of the kinds of resistance that I've mentioned to you. Spiritual resistance everywhere. Resistance in the partisans, resistance in the camps, resistance even on the doorstep of the crematorium. Now, this is not to be Pollyannish, and again to say that there couldn't be more, there couldn't have been more, there weren't misjudgment, there weren't corrupt human rights officials, there weren't corrupt policemen. But in some way, the right question isn't, why wasn't there more Jewish resistance? The question was, how could there be so much? Thank you.
Second.